Hello again, everybody. Joseph Blake here with jblakePhoto.com on our part 2 of Lightroom and Photoshop workflow techniques. Diving right in, you'll notice that right here on the desktop I've got a folder labeled SD-Zoo. That's where we imported that photo from the memory card, and there's that one shot. Now if we go back into Lightroom, you'll notice that there's our photo, and it's got it in the SD-Zoo folder. Now right now we're in library view, so I'm going to go ahead and bring this image up and we're going to look at it full screen. Now unlike the preview that we had been looking at, this is an actual full rendering of this particular image. So we're looking at it in all its glory. Now we can always adjust the rendering, but this is the full image. Changes that we make here are changes to the real image. Now one of the really great things about working with RAW in Lightroom is that any change we make is non-destructive. What that means is that it doesn't actually change the file. So we can adjust things like brightness, saturation, clarity, or a number of other attributes, and it won't actually change the file. That's really nice because if we decide to go back later, we can make changes again and they won't degrade the image. Now in library mode, we do have a number of controls. We can change the preset of the image. We can adjust white balance, basic tone controls, and we can also add keywords and metadata. Now this is really great if you're using a service like Flickr or if you plan to heavily curate your catalog. We're actually going to move into the develop screen because that's where a lot more of the tweaking is going to happen. So now in the develop screen you'll notice a few things. First of all, the presets have been moved to the left and they've expanded. This gives you quick access to a lot of your artistic flourishes that you might be adding to your photos later. On the right hand side you'll notice that tonal adjustments and white balance have been expanded. We now have access to a more adjustable tone curve, and color controls have considerably expanded. In addition, we get access to sharpening and noise reduction tools, lens correction, and some effects. Now the first thing that I want to get into are some of the more technical aspects of our image. So I'm going to scroll here to the top, and the first thing I'm going to look at is our histogram. The histogram is basically a map of all the levels of light in your image, from the left with the blacks, to the shadows, to the highlights, and to the whites. Now you'll notice there's these two little triangles here. What these triangles do is they tell us what areas of your image are actually lost due to either too much light or too much black. Now in this case, if I turn on our highlights, you'll notice that over here in the sky we've got some bright white spots. And if I turn on the shadows, you'll actually see down here in the tree there's a little bit of detail loss. But overall, not much at all. So I'm going to keep that information on as I make adjustments, just to make sure that I don't end up removing any detail as I increase or decrease exposure. So now I'm also noticing that in the image I've got this pole in the background, and it's just driving me a little crazy because I know that it's a little off kilter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the crop overlay tool, and it's going to bring me up the crop, which I actually don't want to use. What I want to use is the angle tool, the straighten tool. I'm going to click on this tool and I'm going to go along the edge of this pole because I know that it should be straight. And it's going to rotate my image automatically. I'm going to check to make sure that in the corners I'm not actually losing any detail or any information that I might want. And I'm going to double click, and there it is. The other thing that I have is this post on the left hand side. Now I was actually shooting through a window because they don't normally let you get real close to the animals. And so I'm going to crop that out. So I'm going to go back into the crop tool. And I'm going to bring this in just a smidge. And then I'm going to align this image using the rule of thirds. And there we go. Alright, now I'm very happy with that. That looks pretty good. Now I'm pretty happy at the way that this image looks from a white balance perspective. But I'm going to go over to my white balance control and I'm going to see if Lightroom thinks differently. And what I'm noticing when I change that is that it gives it a little bit more of a yellowish hue. It's changing the temperature just a little bit, but I'm also losing a little bit of detail now in the nose of the lion. So I'm going to go ahead and reset that back to as shot. I was actually pretty happy with how that came out. I do, however, want to bring up the exposure of the image a little bit. I feel like it could be a little punchier. So I'm going to bring this up just a smidge and see what that gets me. Now at half a stop, I actually lose a little bit more detail here in the sky, but I'm a lot happier with how the overall image looks in the center. I'm happier with how the lion looks. I'm also going to modify my contrast and bring that up about 20 points. Now, in Lightroom, if we actually click down here, we can actually take a look at the before and after versions of our images. And we can get real close in on the actual lion. I'm happy with the increase in exposure, and I'm really happy with the increase in saturation. I'm also noticing that I'm getting a little bit more detail out of the lion's face here in the nose, not as much shadow clipping. If you look at the histogram, you'll notice that it's much more widely dispersed, and we don't have all that information jammed up in the shadows. Now that I've modified the exposure and the contrast of the image, I'm actually going to start in on some of the more complex tonal adjustments. Now, first things first here is in the highlights. It was an overcast day, and I'm noticing that I'm still getting some areas where it just feels a little blown out. So I'm going to bring this information down here in the highlights by about 50 points, just to see how it looks. The image doesn't look adversely affected, and we've still got lots of information. As a matter of fact, we've reduced the clipping here in the highlights. In the shadows, I'm actually pretty comfortable with where the image is, but I'm going to manipulate it a little bit just to see what we end up with. Now, if I bring up the shadow detail just a little bit, you'll notice that the under part of this tree has gotten a little brighter, and we're getting a little bit more detail out of this tree back behind this fence. Now, in some cases, I would manipulate the whites and the blacks, but in this case, I'm pretty happy with the amount of dynamic range that we've pulled out by modifying the highlights and the shadows, and I don't really see a need to adjust the whites and blacks. Now, below the tone control, we have what we call presence. Now, this gives us a couple of things. The first is clarity. Clarity is kind of a combination between increasing saturation as well as increasing sharpness. A lot of people use this to create kind of a pseudo HDR or high dynamic range effect. Now, with portraits of people, I wouldn't normally use this unless I was going for a particular artistic look, but in this case, since we're dealing with an animal, I'm going to play with it, and we're going to see what we end up with. So if I increase the clarity of this image, you'll notice that the highlights become a bit more punchy, and we get a little bit more shadow contrast. I'm going to look at that wide. I like that, but I think we've done a little much. So I'm going to bring it down about half as much as I did, from 60 down to 30. Now below that, you'll see the vibrance and saturation controls. Now these are very similar, but vibrance increases saturation without increasing skin tones. This is helpful when you're dealing with people, since you don't want orange or burnt out skin. Since we're dealing with a wild animal here, I'm just going to increase the saturation by about 10 points. Not a whole lot, but I just want to add a little bit more color there. And you can see the difference from one side to the other. Now the next section in the develop screen is the tone curve. Now the tone curve allows us to adjust the highlights, lights, and darks again, but in a slightly different way than the actual tone controls up here. We can actually adjust these point by point. This is considerably more precise than the controls that we had before. I'm going to leave this alone, and if I have any additional need to change this, we're actually going to be using a curves control inside of Photoshop. Now below that are our color controls. We have hue, saturation, and luminance. What this allows us to do is control where the reds are in relation to each other, all the way through the magentas. So if we want to make something that's green, let's say, a little bit more yellow, we can shift that slider, and suddenly we get more fall colors. Or we can push them more into the blue, and we get something a little more otherworldly. Now in this case, what I normally do is just kind of run through these and make minor shifts. There isn't really a right way or a wrong way to do this. You kind of have to look at it and see what works best in your eye. Now I've skipped ahead a little bit after making some of these adjustments, and I wanted to show you the changes I've made and why. First of all, you'll notice that I've taken, in the hue category, I've taken the reds and the oranges and shifted them together a little bit. The reason for this is I wanted the orange and red hues in the fur to really pop out. I've also changed the overall saturation and the luminance of the surrounding green and blue so that the shrubbery around the lion isn't as present. Now, I'm not going to do anything with split toning, but if I wanted to adjust the actual color of my highlights or my shadows, I could do that. This is very commonly used for more artistic effects or to simulate older types of images using film. Moving into the details pane, we're going to take a closer look at an area of the image that I'm very interested in, which is the eyes of the lion. So using the pinpoint tool here, and then clicking on the lion, that becomes our centerpiece. Now, I'm not going to make any changes to sharpening inside of Lightroom because I have a technique that I'm going to show you later in Photoshop that gives us a little bit more control, and it also gives us a lot better sharpening than what you have by default inside of Lightroom. Moving down to noise reduction. This is very effective when you have noisy images or images that are using a higher sensitivity or ISO level. Now, this is taken with ISO 400, so we really don't have a whole lot of noise. But when we started, we did increase the exposure of the image by just a little bit, as well as the contrast, as well as the shadows. Now, in some cases, this can bring out some noise in the image that wasn't as visible before. So to counteract that, we're going to add just a little bit of noise reduction with luminance control. Now, what luminance does is it reduces noise in the light and dark information of the image. Now, reducing that by just a little bit, we are going to lose a little bit of clarity, but I'm not going to use too much, probably about 10. That should just about do it. Now, all camera sensors have some amount of noise, so Lightroom will automatically set your color noise reduction to 25. Now, in the case of this particular image, when we get in close, I'm noticing a bit of noise here in the coat, as well as around the face. So I'm going to increase this to about 40 and see how we do in terms of loss of detail. Not seeing any loss of detail, and I am seeing a reduction in that noise. So I'm pretty happy with it. I'm going to take another look at the side-by-side before and after comparison, and I'm pretty happy with the end result. Now, the next step in adjusting this image is going to be lens correction. Now, the first thing that you'll see here is color lens correction. What that basically means is that when light enters the lens of your camera, it's supposed to reassemble at the sensor. And that doesn't always happen exactly right, for a number of reasons. Every lens and every camera has some sort of aberration. When we turn this on, Lightroom will automatically detect and attempt to remove these chromatic aberrations. In addition, we have the ability to manually adjust fringing. Fringing is when highlight areas of the image cast a blue or purple or green hue. Now, in this particular image, if we look around, especially towards the edges, we'll see these fringings. For example, right here. In this highlight area here, if we zoom in real close, you can see the fringing at the top of this highlight. So now in this case, you can use the eyedropper tool to select the fringe area, or you can adjust it manually. I prefer manually. So I'm going to set my green hue slightly bluer, and I'm going to increase the amount of reduction. And you'll notice that it kind of goes away. Now, once we've done our color correction, we're going to move over to the lens correction profile. Profile correction will actually adjust the image based on the lens that you took the image with. And it has a profile list full of all the most commonly used lenses. In this case, the Sigma 24 to 70 millimeter. And it knows what kind of distortion that lens has inherently in its profile. If we turn it off, you'll notice. And if we turn it back on, you can see the difference. Now, if you're not sure if this is done enough, or if the lens that you have isn't included in the profile, you can do it manually. Vertical and horizontal distortion, as well as rotation and scale, and vignetting are all included in the manual correction. For effect, you can also add additional vignetting or grain for a more film type look. Now I'm not going to add any of these effects, and our next step is to head off to Photoshop. In part 3, I'll go over Photoshop adjustments and workflow in between Photoshop and Lightroom.